My name is Clare Demerse, and I work at the Broadbent Institute in Ottawa, and that's a national sustainable energy think tank. I work on climate change policy.
Okay, and I previously thought Canada was one of the better countries for environmental policy and environmental protection. Are we not?
On climate change, we are really amongst the worst in the industrialized world. And, every year, actually, there's evaluations that come out at these UN climate conferences that rank countries. And last year, Canada finished only ahead of Saudi Arabia in the top 60 biggest polluters. And that's because Canada has very high emissions per capita. We're in the top 10 in the world in absolute emissions. We're in the top 10 in per capita emissions. And we keep doing things like expanding the oil sands, which leads to projections that our emissions are just going to keep growing. On the other side, we don't have the major policies that we need to cut them. So we don't have a price on greenhouse gas pollution, we don't have a cap on it, and we're not making the kind of economy-wide changes we need to transition to a clean energy economy.
Wow. And why? Why is Canada doing this? Why are we the worst polluter? What?
It's a really tough question because I think about that one all the time. And to me, when I look at Canadians, they care about the environment. Canadians really, I think, identify with the wild spaces that we have in our country. It's a huge, beautiful country. People get that. And we know from survey after survey that Canadians want to see their country lead on climate change and on other environmental issues. So, to me, there is no reason in the world for us to be playing this role of laggard. But, fundamentally it comes down to political will. So our government has not taken the steps and has not sort of been courageous enough to put the policies in place that would change our trajectory. So our emissions are, as I say, on track to keep growing, and they're not doing what it takes to bend the curve.
Why?
So I don't really know, in the sense of, I'm not at the cabinet table, right? And I should also be clear that that's not true for all parts of the government, in that I work on the federal government. I work on the guys in Ottawa, but we do have some provinces that are acting. But, I think we have to acknowledge the role that the oil sands plays in all of this picture. So they're only 5% of our national emissions right now, scheduled to keep expanding, keep growing. But I think they play a disproportionate weight in Canada's failure to take strong action on climate change. I think if the government is putting in place, or failing to put in place, policies in a way that I think the government clearly has a vision of the oil sands continuing to expand. And so they're looking at clean energy policies in Canada and in other places as threatening to that. And so, for example, we actually were involved this week in publishing some documents that we obtained from the government through access to information. And so those are internal emails that show our diplomats, Canadian diplomats, in the embassy in Washington, working against a U.S. clean fuels policy. So the U.S. was trying to clean up the fuels that its federal government could buy. And we have Canadian diplomats emailing Exxon and saying, essentially, can you work with us on this? We have them working as well with administration officials in the Bush administration and trying to repeal or kill this policy. And at one point, there's somebody, this part to me was the most stunning, somebody from Environment Canada writes in this long chain of emails and says, look, actually, from an emissions perspective, it would be great if this rule applied so that we had the tar sands putting technologies in place to reduce their emissions. And the diplomat from Foreign Affairs writes back and says, well, that's simply nutty. So, we're in a situation where this type of thing is going on. I don't know, obviously, whether that's still going on. This was from 2007 and 2008. But it's really striking. It's actually a 200-page access to information document. And I read through the 200 pages, and nobody from our embassy, from Foreign Affairs, at any point ever acknowledges that it might be a good thing to reduce greenhouse gas pollution. They look at this and they see protectionism, they see lobbying against a Canadian industry. They don't see the environmental side of the story. And I think that's a huge concern.
in its simplest terms, why is Canada doing that? Like, is Canada making money off of this?
That's a tough question. I mean, the government of Canada does get money. They get tax revenues from the tar sands. The government of Alberta also gets money from royalties in developing the oil sands. But they also both subsidize the oil sands. And so the government of Canada, for example, there was an assessment that came out just last month that showed $1.4 billion a year in federal, it's essentially tax breaks to oil sands companies. And similarly, the government of Alberta providing essentially the same amount of money every year in royalty breaks to oil sands companies. So, yeah, they're getting some money, but they are also giving away a significant amount of money to this industry. And obviously, I think, these are some pretty profitable companies where we can all think of better ways to spend $1.4 billion a year at this stage in the game. Not just even on climate, but as Canadians, I think we can all think of better ways to get that money out the door.
So what's the deal then? Why?
I feel I don't want to be in the position of sort of inventing the storyline or the excuses for it, because to me, it's not the right way to go about this. It is hugely problematic at this stage in the game, knowing everything we know about climate science, knowing everything we know about the consequences of this problem for Canadians and around the world, the impacts that we're already seeing, for the government of Canada to take this approach. I don't know what is motivating that, but I know that as a Canadian citizen and somebody who works in the environment, that it's a very serious problem, and it's one that every time we come to these UN negotiations, Canada finds itself once again singled out or coming under criticism, and yet we haven't seen the government change.
It seems crazy that we get things like fossil awards, and other countries look at us like, what are you doing? My country's going to be underwater, and you're putting the greatest amount of emissions in an industrial project into the air. Like, how can Canada, from your perspective, how can Canada justify all this?
When I see the government, the way that they talk about these issues, I should say we have negotiators here, I think, who work hard on their own technical issues. But when we see the political level coming in, fundamentally, they don't see this problem as being as urgent and as serious as, you and I do, as people who care about climate change do. They do not seem to have taken on that the world needs to make a very serious transition away from the use of fossil fuels. I think their vision of a future is one in which fossil fuels continue to be, as they put it, a strategic resource, something that there will always be a market for in Canada and around the world. And they're taking actions that they see keeping that going. And as I say, that's very problematic, because that's in contradiction to what we need to do to deal with climate change.
Sort of selfish, eh?
Well, I think that's a huge part of this issue that people don't always realize is this is actually a global problem. So our actions in Canada have very real consequences for people in other countries, and it's kind of the cruel irony or the fundamental injustice of climate change that the people who've done the least to cause the problem are feeling the consequences first and hardest and have the fewest resources to deal with climate change. So one of the big issues on the table here in Cancun is about creating a global fund to support developing countries as they adapt to climate change and as they reduce their own emissions. And that's something that we absolutely need to do, because these are people who have huge needs from some of the actions that we've taken. In Canada, we're actually, as well as one of the top 10 absolute emitters of greenhouse gases, and per capita, we're in the top 10 cumulative emitters of greenhouse gases. So we've been putting this stuff in the atmosphere and growing our economy as a result for a very long time.
Yeah. Does Canada, does Canada want things to be warmer? Are they bitter that it's cold?
It's so cold in our country, we need to do something about that.
Speed this global warming thing up a little bit?
Oh, it better not be that. Because particularly, people in northern Canada, there's people here who are representatives of First Nations in the Yukon. I met with First Nations up in Inuvik, and they are adamant about their concern about climate change and the fact that they have, the right to snow and ice. This is some of the way I've heard people put it. So this is, their culture is obviously adapted to deal with that particular climate and that particular set of very difficult environmental circumstances. And though if you ask the people who face the most cold and snow and ice, they're people who absolutely want to see Canada tackle this problem.
Yeah. If there's one thing you thought, every Canadian or every world citizen should know, what would it be?
What a great question. I think, so in terms of every Canadian, I think it's that Canadians need to realize that our government is not a leader on this issue, that this issue is a priority, and that we could be a leader. There is no reason in the world why Canada can't do well. I mean, at these talks, we see a country like Norway, which has an equal share of oil and gas in its economy, and yet has a climate policy that's based on science, makes a huge contribution to the world effort to tackle climate change, both in terms of funding, in terms of policy ideas, in terms of putting technologies in the ground in their own country to deal with climate change. So it's not inevitable that Canada has to be a laggard. We could be a leader, and we haven't made that choice. And in terms of world citizens, sorry about Canada's performance. We're doing everything we can to try and improve so that we're not disproportionately hurting people in other countries.
Do you feel a little bit bad as a Canadian that we're so horrible?
I find it tough. I mean, it's one of these things where, we go to these meetings, we run around all day trying to understand the negotiations, and I do kind of come home at the end of the day and sit in my hotel or apartment and say, okay, that wasn't really a good day, And I think, though, that the vast majority of Canadians, and I think this not just from my own personal experience, but from surveys and polls that I've seen, this isn't what Canadians want. I think Canadians do want our country to do better, and they do care about this issue. I think there's very high rates of concern about climate change amongst Canadians, and I think we're seeing people taking measures in their own lives in terms of just, thinking more about where the food on their table comes from, or where the energy behind their electricity switch comes from. I think we see people thinking more about taking public transit, all the so small things, but I think this issue is really a higher priority with Canadian citizens than it is with Canada's government.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. One more thing. What do you think the Indigenous people of Canada, do you think that they are a force to be reckoned with?
Oh, absolutely. So, Indigenous people in Canada are a very important part of this conversation, both for sort of constitutional legal reasons, but also because I think they carry a real moral weight in terms of dealing with this issue. There are communities living upstream of the oil sands, for example, who are feeling some of those impacts in a very prominent way, and they've done a really important service, I think, in telling that story, and particularly Northern Canadians as well. When we look at climate change as a whole, these are people who are on the front lines, and I think they absolutely are a force to be reckoned with, and some of that's been recognized internationally. People like Sheila Watt-Cloutier, who have really played a key role in showing the human aspects of climate change around the world.